Welcome to Lesson 5.2, Grade 7s. This is the background to war. Why were France and England drawn into conflict in their colonies here in North America? Let's find out. So stick around and let's learn something. The French, the English. Why are they always fighting with each other? And why were they drawn into conflict here in North America when they are European countries? This is lesson 5.2. It's a background to war. We learned about the 7 Years' War a little bit yesterday. Not really 7 years. We're calling it the 7 Years' War, but as we saw yesterday, it lasted more than 7 years. So more about that a little bit later. But the 7 Years' War was almost a world war because it was a war between France and England. Okay, Mr. Phil's like, how was that a world war? Well, hear me out. France and England, they had territories all around the world. So they were in India, they were in Africa, the Caribbean, North America here, right? We're in North America. And they also had allies all over the world too. So when they were fighting, their allies and their colonies would have to go and fight in these battles as well. And the reason that they were fighting, well, they wanted resources and they wanted territories, and they wanted to be the ultimate supreme superpower that is on the planet. So it's natural that they are going to go to war with each other. France and England, they were always at war. So from a French perspective, we need to take a look at what the French were feeling in North America. And they were a very well-established group here in North America. And you can see it here on the map. New France is taking up a large amount of territory. They had colonies in Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton and all the way down south in Louisiana, where New Orleans is. They were also in Acadia, so Nova Scotia, and they had a really good footing in North America. But the main French, even though you take a look at this map, the main French area was along the St. Lawrence River, where Montreal and Quebec are today. Most of the people who were living, most of the French people who were living in North America at the time, they weren't born in France. They were born here in North America. And they didn't necessarily see themselves as French. They saw themselves more as Canadiens. Okay, they had their own sense of identity. They had their own culture. They had their own unique way of doing things. But they were still French. And being that they were still French, they had this real strong sense of security because they thought France was going to protect them. They also had really excellent strongholds in both Quebec and Louisbourg. So they were thinking, you know what? We're good here in North America. Things are going to be okay. We've talked about the French. What about the English perspective? Well, the English, from the English point of view, the 13 colonies, well, this is not from their point of view, this is actually what happened. The 13 colonies outnumbered that of the Canadiens. And the 13 colonies, we're talking, there's millions of people here, whereas in New France, we're talking, thousands, tens of thousands, things like that. So the 13 colonies vastly outnumbered the Canadiens, and 13 colonies wanted more farmland. So they started encroaching into French territory. That means moving into French territory. The English wanted to trade with more First Nations. The First Nations had a lot to offer that to the English, so they wanted to trade more. France, they had been controlling the Ohio access. They were controlling the Ohio Valley, so the access to the valley, and the English could not get into that valley and onto the other side to where the farmland was. So the English felt trapped. On the Atlantic side, the English wanted to control the fisheries. So cod is there, but the French are there, and they're bringing this cod to Europe because it's an important staple in the European diets. And there was a huge profit to be made there that the 13 colonies wanted. And the English wanted more control of the St. Lawrence River because that's the gateway into the interior. You take the St. Lawrence River, you are going to make it to the Great Lakes. It just makes it so much easier to trade and do business. So now we've got both sides why they're wanting to do the things that they're wanting to do. But there's strengths and weaknesses to both sides. From the British side, they are the most powerful navy in all of Europe. That navy is going to help them control the seas. They were very prosperous in their colonies of New England, okay? And those colonies are going to be providing military supplies. And they had the Haudenosaunee later on as allies. The French, their strengths, they were the most powerful army in Europe. So the British had the navy, but the French had the army. They had these strongholds in Louisbourg and in Quebec, which is going to be important because if the British want to do anything, they are going to have to take out those strongholds first. And the French, just because of the way their business practices were, they were allies with a ton of First Nations. So they had First Nations on their sides. The British weaknesses are as follows. They had an army that wasn't really good at fighting in North America within the forests. They were more of an open field type of army. So that's definitely going to be a weakness. We already talked about this as a French strength, but the British weakness there on the flip side is that they needed to capture those two fortresses, the one in Quebec and the one in Louisbourg. We need to capture these strongholds. And another weakness is, even though the 13 colonies supplied a lot of military supplies, they were always kind of bickering with each other. Not fighting yet, but just kind of like annoyed with each other. French weaknesses is that in North America, they had a huge dependence on France for any kind of supplies that were needed. You saw in the map previous that they had a lot of territory. Well, the more territory you have, the more you need to spend on defending that territory. It's going to be very difficult. There was only one entry point. That was the St. Lawrence River, and that's going to be easy to block. So in a time of conflict, you can easily block that river, which is going to kind of cripple your people that are inside the interior. And they couldn't really agree on any kind of defense policy. So we'll see later that the military and the government officials, they weren't seeing eye to eye on a lot of things. But the French had the fortress at Quebec. If you've ever been to Quebec, you'll see this. The walled town is higher up, and the shops and things are down in the lower part of the town. But this provided the Canadiens a really strong sense of security. It was by far the largest town in New France. There was 8,000 people by the year 1750. Not a lot by today's standards, but by the standards of the mid-1700s, that's a pretty big town. They were the center of power here in North America for the French-speaking Canadiens. And I already talked about it being two towns. We had the walled fortress, which was the upper town. And then the lower part had all of the shops and the warehouses and obviously the port. And it was in a perfect location. It was where the St. Lawrence River narrows. This is where Quebec is situated, which means all ships have to pass the city of Quebec, and they have to pass within the range of Quebec cannons. And this is going to be a really easy place to defend, because the only way you're going to be able to access Quebec easily is through that of the St. Lawrence, and those cannons are going to get those ships. But here's where the war actually starts. The war starts in the west. There's a picture here. This is George Washington. You may have heard of George Washington because he is the first president of the United States, but he was also in the army, and he started this war in 1754 in the Ohio Valley. But he lost. He didn't win that war. But they kept trying, they kept trying, they kept trying. They won a second time. The British weren't able to win a second time because of the way the French were fighting. The French adopted the tactics of the First Nations, and they were able to fight fight within the forests. And the British Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt, after this second loss that the British suffered in the Ohio Valley, he promised he's going to send more soldiers, he's going to send more ships, and he's going to spend so much more money in this war that is kind of brewing and rumbling out here in the West. And he is determined to be victorious in this battle. All right, what I'd like you to do is head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.